The work undertaken by the coalition, like the center or the corner piece of the puzzle, played a crucial role in helping to better inform the electorate, and in doing so, enabling the electorate to make an informed decision about the future of this country, their lives, and their livelihoods. Welcome to Behind the Facts, a podcast that focuses on shining a light on the individuals that work behind the scenes, curbing the spread of false and misleading information, and fostering a culture of accuracy. I am your host, Tipe Maelane, coming to you from the Radisson Red Hotel in Rosebank, Johannesburg, where we will be giving you behind-the-scenes coverage from the South African Election Coalition event, focusing on the coalition's efforts to promote a culture of accuracy and transparency before, during, and post the 2024 South African national election. Here is Cayley Clifford, Deputy Chief Editor at Africa Check, speaking on the coalition's work focused on combating election misinformation.
Over the years, I've heard about multi-pronged strategies for combating false information. I once heard multi-tentacular, but I quite like this puzzle analogy, and I would agree that the coalition that we formed in South Africa was quite an important part of broader efforts to address the challenge of election misinformation. But I wanted to share a little bit today about how we settled on this model, because Africa Check has been covering elections on the continent since 2012, and we have come to expect the spike in mis and disinformation that usually occurs around this time. The sheer volume is more than any one organization can handle on their own. And so on an ad hoc basis, we have long partnered with social media platforms, civil society, media houses to combat election misinformation together. But in recent years, we have entered into more formal coalition agreements with a wider group of partners and with very specific goals in mind. Now, these election coalitions look different in every country, of course, depending on the media landscape and the context. In South Africa, we knew that we wanted a very diverse range of stakeholders to come on board ahead of what was a really pivotal election. We heard analysts warn for months ahead of the vote that there would be a major reshaping of the political landscape. And I think to an extent, this uncertainty created fertile ground for false information to really flourish. And of course, we know now that this was exploited to do things like attack the credibility of the IEC. And it was in this context that this group of civil society organizations and media organizations began working together in the run-up to the South African election. The ultimate goal was to ensure that people had access to accurate information so that when they went to the voting booth on the 29th of May, they could make an informed decision. And there were three main ways we thought we could do this. One was by fact-checking claims and statements made by political parties and politicians. Two was by providing voters with non-partisan information on issues that were really key to them. And three was equipping the public with the skills that they would need to combat election misinformation and to recognize it on their own. So these are some of the highlights of the work that we did in the last few months. We started with a series of fact-checking and verification workshops where journalists from local newsrooms around the country participated in immersive 2-day training. The idea with the training was that, of course, we would have more people on board to combat election misinformation. But we were also interested in strengthening the fact-checking skills of journalists and improving the quality of reporting throughout the election period. Of course, much of the coalition's work focused on promoting accuracy in public debate. We did this by fact-checking claims made by politicians and political parties, whether that was on the campaign trail or in election manifestos. And then, of course, we did quite a bit of fact-checking with claims that were going viral on social media. With this work that was produced across the coalition, we encouraged or cross-publication so that we could reach as many diverse audiences as possible. But fact-checking is often reactive, right? So we wait for a politician to make a claim, we wait for information to go viral on social media, and then we respond to it with a fact-check. And arguably by this time, much of the damage has already been done. The claim has been allowed to spread, and we're essentially playing a game of catch-up. It's why we felt really strongly that our efforts should include this idea of pre-bunking. We need to proactively provide voters with information that they can rely on. Something that I find myself wondering about is whether false information about electoral fraud, for example, would have been as effective had people been able to access information about how the whole voting process worked more easily. So, in other words, would more pre-bunking have worked, and what should that have looked like? I think one of the main benefits of working in a more formal coalition or grouping is that members of the coalition were able to more easily share resources with one another. So we were able to flag, promote, highlight the use of tools like Africa Check's help desk for journalists. There were AFP digital investigation technique courses, and then the SANEF elections portal, which housed a wide range of resources for journalists reporting on the elections. And then through our long-standing relationship with FullFact, a fact-checking organization in the UK, we were able to provide access to coalition members a range of artificial intelligence tools that make the work of finding and responding to false information much easier. Now, this is not a perfect model, as we look to replicate it in several countries that are still to have elections this year on the continent. We are learning more about how this will work best as we go. One of the things that I think has become very clear is this work needs to begin well before elections. Whether it is forming a coalition, deciding what the focus will be, providing the training. During election time, everyone is stretched, everyone is busy. And so to have a very clear idea on what the coalition hopes to achieve, what members are expected to do, is really useful. But more than that, I think working in the relative quiet between elections means that coalition partners have time to build relationships with one another, with institutions, and build up a bit of a track record that sets them up to really have an impact and an effect. The last thing, when we started this process, I think I had visions of each journalist trained going back into their newsroom and producing 3 or 4 fact checks of their own. And I realize now that that was probably unrealistic. Journalists don't always have the time and the resources to do the kind of painstaking, standalone fact-checking reports that we are used to seeing at Africa Check. And I think that's okay, because there is evidence, of course, to show that fact-checking works, but on its own, it is simply not enough. Combating misinformation really requires a 360-degree approach, from media literacy to quality truth-telling journalism, to working with institutions to improve people's access to accurate information. What I think worked really well is the training in combination with cross-publication, the sharing of resources and information, helped us to reach a really critical mass of people. And this is something that we will look to continue as we go forward. But even that is not enough unless we are also working with social media platforms, government agencies, to preempt where we can and to call out political disinformation.
That was Cayley Clifford, Deputy Chief Editor at Africa Check. We spoke to Nomshado Lubisi from Media Monitoring Africa on the role they played in the coalition. Here's the conversation.
Hi, Nomshado.
Hi.
It's a pleasure to have you join us today for today's episode of Behind the Facts. And we just want to find out for our audiences, how does Media Monitoring Africa come to be part of the coalition? What role is it that Media Monitoring Africa played?
So in 2019, we launched a platform called Real Fun One together with the IEC, which in basis was a platform which allowed South African citizens to be able to submit online harm complaints that they come across. And obviously this platform is really coming in the gap where we have localization issues on platform reporting, such as language, which the platform obviously allows for. And together as well with that speedily reaction to these narratives in a very chaotic period such as elections. So us coming together with Africa Check, I think we've worked quite with each other over the years, but in this particular case, it was around how do we leverage on Real Fun One in terms of the complaints coming in, and obviously sharing that information with Africa Check, ensuring that there's a fast fact-checking mechanism in place.
Now that the foundation's been laid and we've had this coalition and it seems to have been a success from what all of the parties involved are saying, how do we build on this moving forward?
It definitely was, because I think historically we were, amazing organizations, particularly even the media sector, doing their own initiatives around this issue. And the mere fact that we're able to come to one table with our different resources and different expertise areas was quite key, because we're bringing in a diverse, different perspective to the coalition. I think going forth, it provides the mere fact that because the foundation has been laid, it clearly means that now the level can be taken to a higher initiative, I'd say, perspective, whereby now that we know when our next elections are, we can actually start setting up mechanisms and even, go further with what we started in terms of disseminating and cross-campaigning and so forth. And I think really starting to cultivate that resilience that we've all been probing towards.
Thanks a lot for sharing today.
Thank you for having me.
That was Nomshado Lubisi from Media Monitoring Africa.
You're listening to Behind the Facts.
This is Behind the Facts.
This is Behind the Facts.
This is Behind the
This
Facts.
is Behind the Facts.
You're listening to Behind the Facts.
Thanks for tuning in into Behind the Facts.
We caught up with Jean Roux from Graphika on his thoughts on the election coalition.
I think it's very important for us to think beyond the election. How do we build on what we've now put down as the groundwork? How do we move forward? What is the next steps for the coalition?
Yeah, something like an election is a very good stepping stone or a springboard for something like this, because it's a crucial period in any democracy. Once every 5 years, people get together, they go and vote, but you don't want to wait for the next 5 years before you try and adapt and develop this coalition that's been formed. And election is just one form of national event that is susceptible to disinformation. Things like natural disasters, or if there's any times of conflict or strife, all of those things can also be exploited by bad actors when it comes to disinformation. So basically taking the lessons learned from this coalition, applying them consistently over the next few years on these other instances, these other inflection points, if you will, I think that'll probably be the way to go forward. You keep the organizations together, you keep them trained together, you kind of have them practice how to work together to their strengths, so that when the next election does come around, everybody knows their place and their role.
That was Jean Roux from Graphika. Building on the efforts around elections, Sarah Lubala-Smit, info finder and media literacy editor at Africa Check, speaks to their efforts beyond the ballot.
In response to the need for enhanced media literacy among South African citizens following the 2024 elections, Africa Check has created a comprehensive initiative designed to foster critical thinking and informed engagement with media narratives. Our multifaceted approach combines social media graphics dissemination, interactive workshops with high school students, and a targeted radio campaign. This three-pronged strategy aims to equip citizens and young people with the skills necessary to navigate the post-election media landscape effectively, contributing to a more informed and participatory democratic society. So the first portion, the social media graphics dissemination, the goal is to have the general public engage with these graphics to foster critical thinking and informed engagement with media narratives they encounter. So we utilize concise and engaging social media graphics. The campaign addresses key media literacy topics like the impact of social media on election narratives, the pitfalls of opinion polls, the power of political spin, and how a political party might contest elections in South Africa, as well as the importance of fostering civil discourse. And the graphics have been created in 3 languages, English, isiZulu, and Afrikaans, for maximum inclusivity. The second portion, the radio campaign, The objective was to leverage the influence of radio to foster a well-informed public capable of navigating that media landscape I mentioned. So we developed a 5 one-page script focused on enhancing post-election media literacy that focused on the topics I mentioned above. And the goal is to have, we had radio presenters pre-record the scripts and then air it following the election results to really sensitize the public to identifying misinformation. And lastly, we have the portion that focuses on high school interactive workshops. So we wanted to deepen engagement and reach younger audiences by hosting interactive workshops with about 300 grade 11s and 12s across South Africa to foster their critical thinking and empower those learners to navigate the information landscape. And so this is done through our outreach assistant. These hour-long workshops provide hands-on learning experiences and facilitate in-depth discussions on media literacy topics through interactive activities and group discussions, the goal being that students will learn to critically evaluate the information they receive, recognize biases, and discern fact from fiction. All of this is made possible through funding from Meta, and given the number of elections happening on the continent this year, and certainly in the world, we wanted to focus not just on elections, but also what happens in the post-election space, particularly if there's confusion or they're contested, as was the case in South Africa in terms of the government of national unity. That's an entirely new concept to many of us. And so having this campaign was a really important way for people to begin to navigate this landscape.
That was Africa Check's info finder and media literacy editor, Sarah Lubala-Smit. I have been your host, Tipe Maelane, coming to you from Behind the Facts. Continue to follow the conversation online on all streaming platforms, and remember to like, share, and subscribe.